Sergeant de Cragg sat in his modified drop pod, anxiously tapping his foot against the deck. The cavernous cargo hold of the bulk freighter was eerily silent. Normally a ship this size would boast a crew complement of at least 60. Constant activity was a given, with a typical free-shift rotation common in shipping vessels of this size. Now, the hold was a quarter of its normal size. The forward bulkhead was stacked thick with a mixture of shrapnel, energy and radiation shielding layers. It was designed to protect the occupants in the drop pods behind. The rest of the space was empty, save 5 drop pods, including the one de Cragg was occupying. He was blankly staring at his communication pad. The automatic screen sleep mode had kicked, and he was staring at his reflection in the surface. His light green scales and colourful head crest looked dull in the black. As a member of the Confederated Special Operations Command, CSOC, he was used to dangerous missions. De Cragg and his squad had been on dangerous and outright insane missions during the now 7-month-long conflict with the Jikaw Democratic People's Republic, JTPR. Despite the name, the Jikaws were ruled by a hereditary dictatorial regime. They were currently on the 7th generation leader. The society operated on a free-tier caste system. The top was solely occupied by the leader. The second tier was the military. The last tier was everyone else. The Confederation had, for the longest time, operated on the presumption that the Jikaws' formal name meant something. The Jikaws were an insular, flightless avian species. They didn't seek to join the Confederation after their first contact, and steadfastly refused outside access to their free systems. Outside contact with the Jikaw was rare. Trade was always performed by official JTPR merchants. They sold an array of low-grade machine goods, while they preferred purchasing food and a few higher-order goods. The Jikaw merchants were always friendly and frequently spoke of how pleasant life was in the JDPR. The only other contact was the rare roving Jikaw pirate band. They preferred to operate out of hijacked ships and targeted valuable high-technology goods. De Cragg's younger sister, De La, was caught up in a raid of an exotic material production facility a few months before the war started. Jikaw traders were always apologetic when asked about it. They explained that the JDPR had such an effective law enforcement apparatus that it was near impossible to commit crime. Various dissenters and other shady individuals, they said, would flee to the stars to engage in their preferred profession. Confederate law enforcement struggled with finding out what the Jikaw pirates were doing with all their stolen goods. Across investigation efforts by many agencies and species, no one could find where the Jikaw were moving the goods. Nothing turned up on any of the black market channels officials monitored. Everything simply vanished. At least until 2 months before the start of the war, when a consumer goods factory opened a container of Jikaw machinery parts and found a dozen Jikaw hidden away inside. In stark contrast to the well-fed, well-dressed traders, the Jikaws in the container were dressed in ragged clothing and terribly malnourished. Since no one knew the Jikaw language, it took a month for the computer systems to come up with a translation protocol. Afterward, the Confederation learned the Jikaws were refugees who were part of a forced labor camp tasked to build massive planetary defense towers. They said the JTPR was planning on invading a neighboring star system to resolve food shortages due to central mismanagement of their agricultural sector. The refugees also provided details on the inner workings of the species. Their dictatorial nature, a fanatical military that was well cared for, and billions of grindingly poor slaves performing labor. The refugees were only able to escape during the confusion of a large labor transfer effort to retool their facility from export machine goods to munitions manufacturing. They were also a single extended family. Had the family head attempted to escape alone, her entire family would have been executed. Despite the warning, no one in the council believed the Jikaw would invade. The council assumed the Jikaw were outgunned and outmanned, so it would be foolish to attack. They grossly miscalculated what a dying dictatorial society would do to ensure its survival. Then, a vast fleet appeared in a Confederate star system compatible with Jikaw physiology. The ships that appeared were far more advanced than Jikaw had previously indicated. The Confederacy realized how they were able to field advanced weapon systems when their ships began using the same boarding and capture tactics the Jikaw pirates used. Intelligence determined that there were, in fact, no Jikaw pirates. They were JDPR military raids using Special Forces units. The fact that the JDPR was sending trained combat units to engage in piracy answered a few nagging questions De Crag had regarding his sister's ordeal aboard Particle Station Huntsville. How did a supposed ragged bunch of pirates successfully board and control a space station, particularly a station crewed by humans? The few tactics Dagala was able to relay indicated a force that knew how to identify and subdue humans when they were only armed with force sluggers. They deployed drawing tactics, sacrificial ploys, and created a barricaded choke point. Had her now husband not been a human able to take a few hits to the body, and had the mind to create a makeshift airburst bomb, his sister would no longer be among the living. Now the Confederacy was engaged in a drawn-out, bloody battle to retake the planet the Jikaws occupied. The Jikaw military was fanatical and showed little concern with losing soldiers. They threw bodies at the Confederacy by the millions. Worse, the Confederacy had no means of shutting down the logistics feeding the occupation. Logistics in a conflict was always paramount. Many militaries over history, across every species, found themselves on the losing end of a conflict because they forgot to secure a means to supply the combat force. Conflict was as much the soldiers firing at each other on the front, as it was finding a way to starve those soldiers of food and munitions. In space, logistics became remarkably difficult to sever. It allowed even the most brazen military mind to maintain an effective battle. Planetside, cutting logistics was fairly simple. Find the paths material and fresh soldiers could take to reach the front, and sever it. In space, this wasn't possible. Attempting to defend a single star system was a monumental effort, since there weren't convenient choke points, only light years worth of open void a ship could slip through. Worse, subspace FTL allows ships to appear in close proximity to the battle. While subspace inhibitors existed, trying to net more than a light minute beyond a planet was virtually impossible. The power requirements were too great beyond that point. Species that made it to space quickly learned to avoid engaging in organized armed conflict. Since battlefields were wide open voids easily reinforced, conflicts were long and bloody by default. It no longer made sense to engage in open warfare, since it quickly wore down both sides. A wide open regulator produces a hot flame, but will also exhaust the fuel in the tank in short order. Even knowing this, the Confederacy wasn't stupid. A standing military was still maintained since the galaxy had multiple unaffiliated races and alliances. While they knew it was silly to go to war, the Confederacy also knew that didn't mean they could disarm. Having a military at all was the equivalent to weapons of mass destruction many pre-FTL species developed. Crippling a logistics chain, therefore, requires subjugating an entire planet. This proved a major hurdle with the Jikaws. While military intelligence determined the Jikaw war production system was shaky, and would only require the loss of one planet's production to cripple their effort, doing so would be a monumental task. Since the Jikaws were so secretive, no one noticed they had built up their free planets into massive fortress worlds. Planetary defense towers had multiple overlapping fields of fire, and each of their worlds had a 1 light-minute subspace inhibitor net. The array was devious. Scout ships needed to travel well within the planetary weapon field of fire to locate the small inhibitor net node. Larger ships couldn't engage in hit-and-run orbital bombardments to address the tower. Attempting to destroy the towers outside the effective range of their weapons proved equally futile. In conjunction with the inhibitor net, the Jikaws set up a projectile warning system. Any physical munitions capable of surviving atmospheric re-entry were intercepted by orbital platforms. The platforms were maneuverable and moved to avoid counter-battery attacks. Energy weapon attacks were useless in an orbital bombardment, since the atmosphere dissipated the energy. All the while, Jikaw transport ships would use the overlapping defense field just outside the subspace inhibitor field as cover to supply the war effort. There was little the Confederacy could do to their worlds other than stand in a pointless stalemate, wasting munitions on a target they couldn't crack. Cracking the net was the mission of Dekrag's squad. Military intelligence, when evaluating the data returned by a small scout ship on a suicide run, identified one weak point in the defensive tower network. While the network on the 3 planets could survive the loss of multiple towers due to the overlap, there was one weak point identified on the Jikaw homeworld. Half of the Jikaw home planet was a vast ocean, which had only a single island roughly in the center. Here, the Jikaw placed a single defense tower. It was the only spot in their network where, if the tower was lost, the planet would have an undefended spot where a fleet could insert. Once a fleet could breach this point, it could use the planet's gravity well to lob physical munitions over the horizon and destroy the remaining defense towers. The problem was reaching the tower. Distance attacks wouldn't work. The plan was to insert a small team and destroy the tower from the planet below. To do so, the Confederacy converted a cargo freighter into a troop delivery transport. The ship, stacked with layers of protective shielding, would be sacrificed to the planetary defense towers. Behind would sit the drop pods. The plan was to set the ship on course for atmospheric entry over the island where the tower was located. When the tower destroyed the ship, the pods inside behind the shielding in the cargo bay would be protected. The Special Forces squad would then hide in the debris, as the momentum carried them the rest of the way. The Jikaw wouldn't care, since the debris would burn up in the atmosphere and would, hopefully, not notice 5 drop pods successfully making landfall on the island. The odds were low. Dekrag, however, recognized the need. The only alternative was a lengthy protracted battle of attrition to see if Confederacy vessels could overwhelm the rate of fire of the defense towers. A 90% chance of 5 deaths was an acceptable calculation against the guaranteed deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Dekrag's finger rubbed against the dark surface of his tablet. Normally, he wouldn't have been this nervous, yet he had received news that changed his outlook on the future. He suddenly didn't want to be on the mission anymore, yet they were, in less than an hour, going to drop out of subspace into a field of deadly fire. The tap of boots on metal tore Dekrag out of his thoughts. He turned up and saw his commanding officer, First Lieutenant Daniel Gore, approaching from the interior of the ship. The human's heavy footsteps betrayed the density hidden in his small frame. He walked crisply over to his drop pod, situated ahead of Dekrag's, and sat. He looked up and, with a small smile, spoke. "Hey, Dek. You ran out on us all of a sudden. Did you get bad news in the last mail call?" Dekrag shook his head. "Sorry, LT. It's not bad news per se. It's actually great news. It just suddenly changed my perspective in life." Daniel leaned back and crossed his arms. "I'm all ears if you want to talk about it. I can't have my sergeant's mind a mess with this mission." "Sure thing, Lieutenant Dan," Dekrag said with a small smirk, as he attempted to cheer himself up with a small joke. Daniel frowned. "I swear, I'm regretting showing you all that movie." Dekrag chuckled. Daniel wasn't like the other LTs Dekrag met over his 15-year military career. While he was an academy grad, top of his class at that, the human was humble. He never disregarded the more experienced sergeant and took his job of getting his soldiers home from the mission. Dekrag sighed as he handed his tablet over to Daniel. "You see, LT, it's my sister, Takala. Well, turn that on and you'll know." Daniel took it. Damn it to hells! I have a hard time pronouncing your names." Dekrag laughed. "Yeah, your larynx isn't designed to handle the guttural hiss. Her husband just calls her Darla." "Darla, right. How is she doing?" Daniel asked. Dekrag only gestured to the tablet. Daniel activated the device and stared at the screen, where he saw an ultrasound image. His face suddenly beamed in a big smile. "Well, I'll be. Congrats, Uncle Dek." Dekrag lowered his head and felt his crest flutter. It was a rare moment of embarrassment. "I bet the news confirming humans and Sinapians are compatible is making its rounds too," Daniel continued, oblivious to DeCragg's embarrassment. Nah, DeCragg replied. Everyone knows about the weird convergent evolution effect. There aren't too many variations DNA can make to produce a species capable of space travel. We haven't even found an alternate to DNA, since it doesn't seem anything else is even capable of producing life. The effect ends up making us mostly the same where it counts. Any given species can successfully reproduce with about 70% of the other species out there. Even if you can't, a mixed-race child probably can via the other parent's contribution. It'll just get added to the list. Not that it matters much, apart from the weird fetishes. We instinctively know if it'll work or not by finding the partner appealing. It's still new to humans, Daniel said. We've only been out in the galactic community for a century. We haven't managed to form that many mixed species parents yet. I'm mostly curious what the kid will look like. DeCragg shrugged. I do too. I just hope he doesn't end up with too much hair. That would look weird. Daniel's face suddenly turned serious as he tapped the tablet. Is this what's bothering you? DeCragg struggled to find his words as he processed the question. Before he could answer, the door leading to the rest of the ship opened, and the boisterous noises of the rest of the squad echoed in the cargo hold. Hey, Sergeant! Why'd you vanish on us? Specialist Fusely said. She was a canine-type species called a Berigan, and had grey fur with white tusks across the cheek. Yeah, we were just getting to the best part. I love how that guy in the power armor keeps getting killed over and over again just to wake up getting kicked, Specialist Rahili added. He was an avian-type species called a Roo. He had green and purple feathers to go along with his purple beak. That's because you love to be woken up like that every day, Specialist Tahili said. She was a tall, lanky, light blue species similar to humans, called an Isilian, though they had a light covering of fur over their entire bodies. Hey, Fushradar, Daniel called out with a chuckle. Tahili rolled her eyes. Seriously, LT? What is it with humans and your obsession with pop culture references? Daniel shrugged. Command made it too easy when they assigned you three to my squad. Sure thing, Lieutenant Dan, Rahili said back jokingly. Daniel groaned. I deserve that. Anyway, I'm just talking to the sergeant here about his mail. Please don't, DeCragg started. He knew it was a futile effort. You see, Daniel continued, ignoring DeCragg, Sergeant DeCragg here is going to be an uncle. Hey, nice, Fusely shouted. I think we should get him a gift to commemorate the occasion. Maybe one of those cloths he could throw over his shoulder for the spit-up, Rahili suggested. That's enough, DeCragg said. He felt his anxiety starting to build. Oh, I think a chest-carrying harness, Tahili remarked. DeCragg's anxiety suddenly burst out as he roared, I said stow it! Drop and give me 20! The three immediately snapped to attention, shouted, Yes, Sergeant! And dropped to give their push-ups. Daniel looked over at DeCragg with concern in his eyes. DeCragg knew special forces were looser with the regulations than normal military units. They routinely went into high-risk missions and had to build a deeper bond to adjust. Excessive rigidity was harmful to the cohesion of a small squad like theirs. After the three stood back up and entered a state of attention, DeCragg sighed. At ease. Sorry for my outburst. This news isn't sitting with me well. The specialists each silently sat in their pods and looked at DeCragg. Daniel broke the silence. Hey, we're here if you want to talk. DeCragg rubbed his hand over his crest. This news, it bothered me. I know what we do is dangerous, and I made peace with that years ago when I signed up. However, now, when I saw that little life on that image there, it hit me. That's a little person that will only ever know his uncle from stories. The fire sat in silence for some minutes as they allowed the gravity of DeCragg's words to absorb in their minds. Look, Fusey said softly, the way I see it is we all have each other's backs. We did some crazy stuff. Border skirmishes, pirate station raids, and we even took over a Jikaw cruiser. We cover each other, or we can come home. Besides, Tahili added, The LT is a human. You know he's not one to be messed around with." "Hey now, don't elevate us that much," Daniel said. Then he smiled. "That said, I am a Tennessee boy who is the descendant of the great Alvin York." Everyone, even DeCrag, groaned at that. DeCrag, thankful for the distraction, spoke. "Not this again. Even if that was true, you're so far genetically distant that he'd be no more related than a random stranger." "Sounds like you need to hear the story again," Daniel said. He tapped on the tablet a few times, and with a low volume, the familiar lyrics to the bluegrass song, Rocky Top, started to play. Daniel then launched into the story about the man who, along with only 15 compatriots, managed to capture over 100 enemies. There was even a point where York had to charge a rapid-fire fortification. "I get it. You humans have something broken up top," DeCrag said, tapping his finger on his own skull for effect. Daniel opened up his mouth to respond, when a beep sounded from his wrist. He looked down and his face went serious. "Buckle up, boys and girls. We're about to exit FTL. See you planet side." DeCrag and Daniel ensured the 3 specialists were secured in their pods, before Daniel checked DeCrag's. DeCrag was happy his LT took his job seriously. A lot of officers thought they were above it all. LT, on the other hand, was always the first into the fight and the last coming home. He was the one who risked not having a follow-up check to ensure his pod was properly sealed. The silence in the pod was stressful. Even though they had dropped out of FTL at the edge of the subspace inhibitor net, it would take a few minutes before the towers would respond. Then it would take a minute or two more for the attack to reach the ship. DeCrag closed his eyes and took calming breaths. After a few minutes, his meditation was rudely interrupted by a thundering pulse echoing from outside the pod. The first munition slammed into the kinetic ship's kinetic shielding. Lights flickered after a second boom, indicating the energy shield had failed. A third boom, louder this time, echoed through the cargo hold as the layers of physical shielding warped. A railgun round impacted against the protective wall, protecting the pods. A final boom was accompanied by a loud crack. The protective shielding array spiderwebbed before his eyes. It was the last thing he saw before the lights winked out. As he sat in the dark, he felt the gravity field vanish and zero-G take over. The power core failed. The last sounds he heard was the whooshing of air as the atmosphere vented into the void. DeCrag prayed the Jikaw defense towers recognized the compromised hull and cut power. If there were any additional follow-on attacks, he wouldn't hear it. No further action came. It would take a few hours for their ship to drift into the Jikaw homeworld atmosphere. All the while, the pods had to remain radio silent. They couldn't talk to each other, and all transmissions of vital signatures was disabled. DeCrag couldn't even obtain a visual, since the blast shield was lowered over the viewport. The long silence allowed worry to ply into DeCrag's mind. For all he knew, he was the lone survivor, drifting through space, along with the 4 corpses of his squad. To distract himself from the intrusive thoughts, DeCrag checked his systems. Pod integrity and life support were green. Orbital approach thrusters were operational. Navigation was good. Reverse landing thrusters were showing as functional. He then checked his weapons. His plasma bolter was secure and still powered. His grenade bandolier was good. His armor survived his sitting down and strapping in. DeCrag obsessively repeated the process over and over again to maintain his sanity. He heard small hisses from outside the pod as the thrusters adjusted the trajectory. They were nearing the planet and could safely maneuver to land on the target island. Rumbling and sound soon followed as the pod entered the atmosphere. When the rumbling subsided to the rushing of air, DeCrag flicked on his life support transponder system. He sighed in relief when the other 4 came back as operational. This meant that everyone survived the trip. The force of the reverse landing thrusters pushed DeCrag in his seat as the pod slowed before subsiding as the pod gently set on the ground. He thanked the top brass for giving them a newer model, not one of those glorified bullets orbital droppers used. DeCrag quickly gathered his gear as the pod door hissed open. He saw his squad exiting, no worse for wear, in the bright light of a full moon. Peering to the sky, he saw the residual streaks of metal burning up on entry. LT made a few hand signs. DeCrag nodded and checked his wrist communicator for the local map. They didn't have much intel to go on, only a basic topographical map and the location of the tower the scout ship was able to capture before it was destroyed. These types of missions with blind parameters were what the Special Forces guys were trained for. They had to move quickly. It wouldn't take long for a patrol to arrive at the landing zone. Identifying a circular route, DeCrag gestured magnetic north, and the squad quickly moved out. The island was forested, giving them plenty of cover as they carefully crept towards their objective. While there was urgency in their mission, the LT kept them moving at a slow pace. Getting caught would be far more disastrous than a delay. Over the 2-hour trek to the objective, the squad evaded 3 patrols. They clearly knew someone was present who shouldn't be there, and were on high alert. The only saving grace was there was a lot of ground to cover, which gave the team plenty of openings to slip through. Special Forces had to know when to fight, and when to evade. They had to save their strength when storming the tower. Reaching the tower, the team stopped at the edge of a clearing, and looked at the target through some tall underbrush. DeCrag didn't like what he was looking at. The defense tower was an array of large anti-capital ship plasma throwers and railguns. The tower was ringed by 6 short-range anti-air guns. Open areas were blocked by tank catchers, while the main road leading to the tower was covered by fortified infantry positions. "What do you think, Sarge?" LT asked. DeCrag looked around. "Not good. Our options are to sneak in behind the tank catchers and use them as cover. Problem is, that will be a running fight. Unfortunately, that's going to be easier than trying to storm down the main road." LT pointed to one side. "What about there?" Looking where Daniel was pointing, DeCrag noticed a thick power cable strung from a pole into the forest. "We should check that out." LT nodded and spun his finger over his head as he led them in the direction of the cable. 2 clicks into the forest, the squad came upon another clearing. This one was a power generation facility. The facility was ringed by a fence. A single road led into the facility, guarded by a fortified station. While not undefended, the power station was a far easier target. If they took that out, the entire defensive array would go dark. "Idiots built their power generator way out here," whispered Fuseli. Dahili peered around the space. "Based on the topography, I bet they ran out of room at the defense complex. This is the only flat space we've seen around here that can fit the generator." "Whatever it is, let's not look a gift horse in the mouth," LT replied. "What are you thinking, Sarge?" "Best option? We circle around and cut through the back fence. I don't know what they were thinking only guarding the road. It's better than trying to hide behind those tank catchers and attacking the fortification," DeCrag said. As LT opened his mouth to speak, a loud alarm whined. It was followed by a green bolt of plasma hurled their direction. LT cursed. "How do they spot us?" Not wasting time, the 5 rolled down into a small depression in the ground. Plasma bolts started to spit over their heads as more Jikaw defenders began to fire on their position. A spotlight soon illuminated them. "Shit," the LT spat. "This isn't good." "We should pull back and regroup," Ridley suggested. "Not gonna work," LT said. "It's not like they're going to forget we exist and go back to a patrol route. If we don't take this place out now, hundreds of thousands will die cracking this nut open." "It's not like we can rush out there either," Fuseli said as she held her head down. Taking his dog tags, LT used the back end as a mirror. He took a grenade off his bandolier and, with his crazy human strength, lobbed it from his prone position. Crying squawks rang out from the enemy beyond. The attack only briefly paused the shots, which resumed once more. "Give me your bandolier, Deck," LT ordered. "I'll draw them to me. You 4 go around back while they're distracted." "Daniel, sir," DeCrag started, as he forgot mission protocol. "That's suicide." Daniel looked back over with a smile. "You forget I'm a human," They'll have a hard time hitting me at a full run, and I can take a few of those plasma rounds. They don't look calibrated to kill me with one shot. No, I'll help out, DeCrack said in a panic. Sergeant, you have your orders, Daniel said in a cool, firm voice. DeCrack sighed as he pulled off his bandolier and handed it to the LT. Yes, sir. LT nodded and pulled another grenade. He lobbed it, and as the second the explosion went off, he ran for a tank catcher along the road. Over here! When the spotlight left the depression in the ground, DeCrack and the others got up to sprint towards the rear of the power station. As they ran, the LT was raining explosive death upon the fortified guard station. The Jikaw inside the fence were all running toward the battle, leaving the back side unguarded. The night was filled with explosions, cries of Jikaws getting shredded, the pulses of plasma rounds hissing through the air, and a strange high-pitched battle cry from the LT. He was raining an entire platoon's worth of munitions on the enemy, all on his lonesome. Under the cover of the racket, DeCrack used his plasma bolter to burn out an opening in the fence. Quickly identifying a back door, the four entered the facility. Moving in a clearing pattern, they hastily moved for a long hall, tossing grenades into side rooms without caring who or what was inside. They didn't have the time to validate combatants. DeCrack would take the brunt of any punishment for violating the rules of war, if it came to it. The squad then reached the main power core. The sound of fighting outside was beginning to wane. After chasing away a few haggard-looking technicians, DeCrack pulled a pin in a grenade on a bandolier taken from a Healy and threw the entire thing at the main power core. Luckily, modern power generators didn't explode. They just fizzled out when their containment was breached. The grenades exploded and the building's power winked out. A few low red emergency lights operated by battery illuminated the room. Apart from a few distant screams of the fleeing technicians, everything went quiet. The squad carefully maneuvered their way to the front of the building and exited. Outside, in the bright moonlight, DeCrack saw carnage. Jikaw bodies littered the ground. Some were torn apart in explosions, while others were burned from plasma charges. Nothing was moving. There were even some with evidence of knife wounds, leading into the fortified bunker at the entrance. Fear rose into DeCrack's chest as he ordered his squad to move toward the bunker. At the entrance, he noticed a spent Confederate plasma rifle lying on the ground in muddy blood. A cold fear took over DeCrack as they carefully entered the door. Inside was carnage. Feathers and blue-green blood. Mixed in were splashes of deep red. Then, DeCrack saw Daniel. He was sitting awkwardly against the side of the bunker, just under the window in the moonlight. He was staring silently ahead, unmoving. Secure this room. They'll be sending a force from the main defenses, DeCrack ordered. What about the LT? Fuseli commented with a soft, shocked whisper. No time for that now, DeCrack snapped. He badly wanted to mourn, but there wasn't time for that now. He pulled out a transponder from his pack and pressed the button. The subspace signal will have notified the fleet the mission was a success. In minutes, the main fleet would be overhead raining death on the other defensive fortifications. Minutes after that, they'd get their exfil. As the specialists got into position, DeCrack kneeled next to Daniel. Death was unlike the films. No one ever got to sit up in a nice position. No one ever got to give their final words before breathing their last. There wasn't a nice sunrise to accompany the gravity of the event. All there was before him was the burnt, mangled body of his commanding officer and friend, staring blankly at nothing on the floor. DeCrack reached down and closed the eyes. He knew that Daniel would not be left behind. DeCrack wouldn't allow it. Peering over Daniel, DeCrack saw the tablet. He picked it up and looked at the screen. While reality never matched the films, DeCrack knew he could do one thing. Loading up the song list, he began to play Rocky Top on low volume. It wasn't a slow, somber song to go with the moment, but it was Daniel's favorite. Before taking up his position with his squad, he opened up the communication link and sent a reply to his sister. It was a single sentence. If you're thinking about names, might I suggest Daniel? After hitting send, he hefted his plasma rifle to the rim of the bunker and aimed it down the road. He controlled his breath in the moonlight as streaks from ships entering orbit overhead grew in number. The invasion had started, and soon the war would end. They could honor the sacrifice of the fallen after it was all over. Daniel had given the greatest sacrifice so Crag could go home to his family.